For 100 years, T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, has been held up as this huge, monumental statement on the modern world. But what if we've all been missing the ghost that's really haunting its pages? Let's take a closer look.
You know, the poem is famous for being bleak and fragmented and just haunting. It paints this picture of a world that's been totally shattered into pieces. But the big question is, shattered by what exactly? For a long time, the answer seems pretty obvious. For a century, the official story, the one we've all been told, is that the wasteland is a product of war. It's always been seen as the ultimate artistic reaction to the sheer devastation of World War I. I mean, critics have pointed to all the corpses and bones and that general feeling of dread and linked it right back to the battlefields of Europe. They've read it as a story about culture falling apart, about spiritual emptiness, and yeah, even about Eliot's own personal problems. And you know what? Those are all totally valid ways to read it. But here's the question that kind of changes everything. What if the main ghost haunting these lines isn't the war at all, but a massive global trauma that we've almost completely erased from our collective memory? That trauma? It was the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which killed tens of millions of people all over the world. So, why is it that we build all these memorials for one catastrophe, but have this collective amnesia about the other? And this contrast is absolutely key. War creates these big narratives of national sacrifice and heroism, stuff we can build monuments to. A pandemic, though, that's a deeply personal, isolating battle you fight inside your own body. It's just different. As the literary scholar Elizabeth Autka puts it, this kind of individual suffering is incredibly hard to turn into a shared public story. There's no grand narrative of sacrifice to build around the loss. It's just pure private tragedy. And so over time, we just forget.
But here's the crucial point. Literature, it turns out, does record these hidden traumas. The evidence of the pandemic is there in the art from that time. The problem wasn't that artists didn't write about it. It's that for 100 years, we haven't known how to read it.
Okay, so if we're going to reread the poem through this new lens, we first need to find a direct link, right? A connection between the author and the virus. And that evidence, well, it's hiding in plain sight, right inside T.S. Eliot's personal letters. And the biographical proof is undeniable. Eliot and his wife both got sick with the flu in 1918. The illness just became this constant, draining presence in their lives, making all his personal and marital stress even worse, until it all just boiled over into a nervous breakdown in 1921, the very year he was finishing The Wasteland. This quote from him really shows how much the virus had seeped into his thinking. For Eliot, influenza wasn't just a disease anymore. He was using the word to describe the entire toxic atmosphere of his life at home, mixing physical sickness with his psychological suffering. But this right here is the smoking gun. In one of his letters, Eliot describes the specific physical symptoms of the flu: extreme dryness and a bitter taste in the mouth. Now remember that phrase. It is the key that unlocks the entire poem's hidden language. So, armed with all this personal context, we can finally go back to the poem itself and start decoding what's really going on just beneath the surface. The first tool we need is this idea scholars call delirium logic. You see, the poem's famous fragmentation, the way it's always jumping between topics and voices, isn't just some artsy modernist style. It perfectly mimics the disorienting, hallucinatory state of being trapped in a high fever. All right, let's start with probably the most famous lines in all of 20th century poetry. We've all heard them, right? But what if we've been reading them from a completely different perspective this whole time? The pandemic reading is, well, it's chilling. This isn't some abstract thought about spring. This is the point of view of a corpse, one of the millions buried in mass graves, speaking from under the earth. And from that perspective, seeing life return to the surface feels cruel. Now let's look at this really visceral, almost grotesque image from later in the poem, a dry, decaying mouth that can't even produce saliva. Sound familiar? This isn't just a metaphor for being spiritually thirsty. It's a direct, physical description of having a severe case of the flu, that extreme dryness that Eliot himself wrote about in his letters. It's the language of a body in crisis.
And throughout the whole poem, there's this persistent, ominous sound, the constant tolling of bells. And traditionally, people have read that in a religious or historical way.
But if you look at it through a pandemic lens, that sound becomes something so much more immediate and terrifying. These aren't the bells of a distant battle. They're the church bells ringing, constantly, right there in the city, marking the endless deaths from the flu.
It was basically the 1918 equivalent of today's ambulance sirens. The sound of civilian life just collapsing.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Why does it really matter if we read the poem as being about a pandemic instead of a war?
Well, the most important point is this. The poem's very structure reflects what it was like to live through the pandemic. The fragmentation isn't just the cultural shrapnel left over from war, it's the delirium of a fever, the shattering of the body, and the breakdown of the mind under the strain of being so sick.
So, the wasteland, when you look at it this way, becomes a memorial that has been hiding in plain sight all along. It gives a voice to a trauma that society just couldn't talk about, capturing not just a spiritual crisis, but the raw physical reality of illness, of suffering, and of survival.
And all of this leaves us with a final, pretty urgent question. The art and the books and the music being created right now are recording our own pandemic experience. So, 100 years from now, will future generations even know how to read it? Or will our story, too, become a ghost?